I'm Kelly Hyman, and welcome to Unresolved, the Diddy cases. Let's welcome Candace Kelley, a 5-time Emmy-nominated multimedia journalist and legal analyst. She has covered high-profile stories throughout her career, including Derek Chauvin trial and the shooting of Ahmaud Arbery. Let's welcome her. Thank you so much for joining us today.
No problem. So good to see you.
So let's talk about the Diddy trial. A lot of people don't understand exactly what he is charged with because a lot of people will see the CNN video and say, oh, he is guilty. Let's talk about the allegations that are brought by the prosecutor in his case.
Yeah, well, we are talking about not only RICO charges, which is this kind of umbrella offense, but then we also have 2 sex trafficking charges and 2 charges of crossing people across state lines for the purposes of prostitution. So in terms of the video, while it relates a little bit in that, if in order to have sex trafficking, you have to coerce someone. Some people will say that that video shows coercion, but the video standing alone on its own has nothing to do with the case because that's a domestic violence issue, that's a state issue. And so that's why a lot of people don't necessarily understand all of these things that are going on, especially when we talk about RICO charges. We think about that in terms of the mafia and the Gambino family. But as we know recently, it's been used for many types of cases, not just how we typically are trained to see it in the media. And for a lot of people, that's a disconnect. But the more you look into the law and understand that you have to get 2 of these predicate acts that they're talking about in the prosecution in order to reach a RICO charge, then the more you kind of understand it. So a lot of moving parts here, a lot of moving parts.
So let's talk about the prosecution case. The prosecution has the burden, and in regards to the RICO charge, who has helped substantiate the RICO charge, and do you believe it is enough to prove the fact that he, in fact, did commit these RICO crimes?
So as you said, the prosecution, they are making their case, and I think so very well. Now, it depends. Does the jury believe what I believe? I think that there were so many witnesses that really spoke to the part of what this RICO charge was about. For example, you have Capricorn Clark. She's somebody who worked for Sean Combs, and she talked about being kidnapped. She talked about seeing drugs. She talked about, the beatings and coercion. And she talked about her life being threatened. So when you talk about specific witnesses like that, this really goes to the heart of the case. Regina Ventura, Cassie Ventura's mother, she was told by Sean Combs, send me $20,000. And in fact, she did. She got a second loan on her home in order to send him $20,000 because she was told by her daughter, Cassie, which you all know who Cassie is, the one who was in that beating video. She was told, look, if you don't give him this money, then those videos, those sex videos are going to be let go. They're going to be shown to the public in and around Christmas. She was extorted for $20,000. There are so many people who, when you start with Cassie, who was our first witness, right? She's like the tree, the strong tree of it all. And then everybody branches out. There are these corroborating witnesses, and we have heard a lot of corroboration. We've also heard the defense say, hey, you're lying, or that doesn't make sense. We've had some situations where the witnesses have been caught out there where it looked like their memory didn't serve them well, or they were biased in some way. Because Cassie, for example, she got $10 million from the Intercontinental Hotel. That was a surprise. So I think that the prosecution and the defense are both doing very good jobs, but the prosecution has certainly made a lot of headway, and that all goes without having heard anything from the defense yet, which we're going to hear within the next couple of weeks.
So let's talk about the sex trafficking charges. Do you think that the prosecution has proved its case? And if yes or no, who helped prove their case and how did they prove the case for the prosecution?
I think that they have proven their case. With sex trafficking, you need fraud or coercion or force. With that coercion part, we have heard from Mia, who worked for the company with Sean Combs. She talked about how Cassie was beaten, leading to someone to think maybe she was coerced. And not just beaten here and there, but beaten a lot. I think that's what spoke to me a lot in this case, was that, she wasn't just beaten, here and there. I mean, at dinner tables, out in the public, out, when they crossed state borders, when they were in cars, just open fists, closed fist punches. So that was very, very heavy. So Mia worked for him. You had Capricorn Clark, who worked for him. Regina Ventura took pictures of her daughter and the bruises that she had. So when we think about coercion, you have security guards, not security guards yet. You have, let's say, Kid Cudi, who even testified. He said he wasn't told about the beatings, but in terms of his car being blown up, she felt like, my goodness, I have to stay with this guy, because even when I try to date someone else, they're going to be in trouble, right? Because we had Sean Combs, who was taken, who took someone, Capricorn Clark, to Kid Cudi's house and said, listen, we're going to kill him. And this was only because he thought that Cassie was dating Kid Cudi. So that coercion, that force, that, my goodness, I'm going to be in trouble if I don't do what he says, is all around in every one of the witnesses' testimonies.
And lastly, the transportation across state lines to engage in prostitution. Do you believe the prosecution has proved its case? And if so, by whom and how did they do that?
What's interesting is we have heard from quite a few people. First of all, the person that's testifying today, Jane, she's talked about at least 8 different guys that crossed state lines to engage in prostitution. They were paid for that. From Cassie, we heard from her mention, and we saw evidence of at least 10 different men who crossed state lines to engage in sex and were paid for it. Again, will the jury believe it? Maybe. These were all cash transactions. We have heard other people, an assistant, talk about paying people for prostitution or setting up rooms for these freak-offs. Now, this is really interesting because the freak-offs and how they've been set up throughout this testimony have been very important. So there's some triggers. For example, where there's baby oil, there's a freak-off. Where there are candles, there's a freak-off. Where there are drugs and ecstasy, there's a freak-off. Or where there's cash present, $9,000, $10,000, there's a freak-off. So we've heard people testify to these different elements that we all know, sitting in the gallery and in the jury, indicate, oh, there's a freak-off that has been consistently been the setup. So yes, from assistants to employees, for example, Mia or Capricorn Clark or Cassie, or testifying today, Jane, they have specifically talked about people crossing state lines to engage in prostitution. And there you would satisfy that particular legal cause.
You hear a lot about drugs. Jane talked about drugs, so did Cassie Ventura. From the big picture of the allegations in the indictment, how do these drugs play a part, if any, in this case, and how do they help substantiate the prosecution's case?
Yeah, so what's interesting is that you've had a couple of people who've gotten an immunity. Let me start there. Because there have been so many drugs involved, they didn't want to get on the witness stand and say, I've been involved in this, because then that could open them up for prosecution. So we've had 2 people so far, because of drugs, say, hey, I can speak on the stand freely now because I have immunity. How this helps with the prosecution's case is that this is one of those predicate crimes that if you check the box of 2 of these crimes, then that means RICO. Remember, RICO means that there are a list of 35 crimes, all right, that were created when this particular law was created, 1970. If 2 of these crimes have been performed over a period of the previous 10 years, RICO is established. One of those crimes is drugs. So we have heard so many, I mean, from ecstasy to ketamine to MDMA to cocaine to marijuana. I mean, you just name it. We have heard all types of drugs. And that's one checkbox to get to the RICO charge. You need two of these predicate crimes to kind of get to RICO. The drugs checks off one of those boxes, and that's why these drugs are very, very important in this whole process for the prosecution's case. Now, what's interesting, Kelly, is that on the other side, when the defense gets on, they're going to say, listen, there were so many drugs involved, and Sean Combs was an addict. Well, that we're going, they're going to justify that by saying he was an addict, a drug addict, a sex addict. So it kind of works on both sides. But you definitely have that drug crime as a predicate crime to get you, one of the two predicate crimes to get you to the RICO charge.
If the jury believed that he was a sex addict, that he was a drug addict, does that negate the allegations and the charge against him, so to speak? Like, okay, he gets a free pass now? How does that work in this case?
It's not that he gets a free pass, but it does what the defense sets out to do. And that is, do I have reasonable doubt? Because this has to be a crime proven or crimes proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Well, did he have the wherewithal to do this if he was a drug addict? Or did he have a problem where this can kind of justify what he did? I don't think it gets you out of the arena that this happened, but it may help when it comes to the penalty phase. Someone who's a sex addict, that helps. Someone who's a drug addict and is willing to come before the court and say, have mercy on me now that you're going to, put me in jail for 13 years. I have a problem and I'm working on that problem. I'm no longer addict. So I think that it works in that way, but not necessarily negating what happens, because all of those things did happen. It just helps kind of have more empathy for him when it comes to the judge penalizing him. Because here's what I think, and a lot of other people think too. He is going to jail for crossing state lines for prostitution. I think even the defense has said, okay, that happened. You had too many people testify for that. But that's up to 10 years in terms of a charge. So, he could get 3 years for it, which is not so bad when he only has already served, 10, 11 months. But that's how that works into it in terms of, okay, what will his defense be? It's going to work on both sides and play out very differently.
Who do you think has been the top 3 witnesses for the prosecution and why?
Top 3 witnesses, I would say off the bat, Cassie, because she was the one who established the groundwork of what happened. But these eye-opening witnesses that really just made me look up from taking notes in courts, Capricorn Clark, the one who said that she was kidnapped, painted this very specific picture, like a movie. She talked about, at gunpoint by Sean Combs being, his security guard, bringing her to an empty building and going upstairs, and a man was smoking a cigarette and drinking coffee, and she was taking lie detector tests for 5 days in a row. Very strong witness when we talk about kidnapping. Her mother, Regina Ventura, very strong witness. This was someone who wasn't even cross-examined. I think that they would have taken a chance to try to question a mom on the stand. Excellent witness, talked about this extortion. She clearly was extorted. And then I would say Eddie Garcia. We have heard about this idea that $100,000 was moved somewhere for this video that we've now seen to be hidden. Well, he got immunity and said, you know what? Me and 2 other people on the security staff at the Intercontinental Hotel, we got that money. So we were finally able to hear, oh, okay, that is in fact true, right? All of those details that we've been hearing about, now someone has actually said it. There's the bribery, there is obstruction of justice, which that is another predicate act to get to RICO. Remember I talked about the drugs before, that's one predicate act. Well, that obstruction of justice, there's 2 boxes right there that get you to RICO. So those, for me, were the most eye-opening witnesses, where they just really revealed stuff that I was taken aback. Like, oh, hadn't heard that before. From all I've read, hadn't heard that before.
It's interesting you didn't choose Jane Doe, who is part of the indictment as well. Is there a particular reason why do you not find her believable, credible?
Jane Doe, who's probably on the stand right now. The hump with her is that there seems to be, throughout her testimony, the opportunity to step back and say no. You know, there's a lot of evidence throughout all of these witnesses, especially her, that speak to her really wanting to satisfy Sean Combs and be a part of this relationship and say, okay, I'll try it, I'll do it. A lot of reluctance, but so far we haven't heard about this serious coercion. They might talk today or tomorrow about how she was, you know, a victim of domestic violence, but we haven't heard that. What we've heard is a relationship where she really wanted to satisfy, make her boyfriend happy. He started paying her rent, and she just felt really reluctant about being part of this. Again, you can argue and have a forensic psychologist argue otherwise, but I'm just saying, sitting in the courtroom, I haven't heard anything where it's like, whoa, my goodness, she was forced, coerced. It seems along the way there were options for her to actually get out. There were even some times where Sean Combs in the text would say, you don't want to do this, don't do it. So it just kind of created confusion. And I think that creates confusion for the jury. So for me, that wouldn't have been a witness that I would think speaks to what the prosecution was trying to do. Listen, she's still getting her rent paid by Sean Combs, $10,000 a month. How that translates, I'm not sure, because she's a prosecution's witness, but she is still getting paid. Again, just so many confusing messages about what she is there to actually prove. Yes, there's the drugs, but we've proven that already. There's a prostitute, but we've proven that already with our witnesses. So I think that the door is still open to see what exactly she is there for, and that's why she didn't necessarily make my list.
The counter argument would be that in regards to sex trafficking, as you stated, you have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. And the fact that he paid $10,000 a month was in fact financial coercion. That in fact that there was voice message from him saying, you need to get on your job, which she interpreted as taking care of him and making sure she did the hotel nights, and in fact that he was on his job, i.e. pay her rent. What do you think about that?
Some good evidence, okay, right? Because every time a witness takes the stand, that is evidence. So some really good evidence, and I would agree that speaks strongly, because that force would be, oh my goodness, he's made me take away all of my financial autonomy, and I'm depending on him. And if I don't do these hotel nights, as she called them, then he's going to take away that money. He even said, you don't want to see what happens. Like, you know, you're going to need me. Like, you do not want to go there. So yes, I think that there is some force there. With the same token, the defense is going to open up the fact that, well, you actually were in these hotel nights that we know as freak-offs for 2 years before the rent was even paid. And again, it's not that I don't believe what she's saying. It's just that I am wondering how the jury will interpret that you were part of these freak-offs for 2 years until you really started getting paid this $10,000 a month rent that you say was holding you there. So it kind of just goes both ways. She's not one of those, 10 prosecution witness like a Capricorn Clark.
So who do you think the prosecution is going to be their next witnesses?
Yeah, so they might go into next week, but there really is word when you sit in there that they're hoping that they end by this week. I can only imagine and hope that Christina Caron, who is the chief of staff and has been for years of the Sean Combs, empire, that she is going to take the stand. This is a woman who has been mentioned, over 50 times. This is a woman who knows all of the details. She knows all of the financial transactions. She's the one who called Eddie Garcia at the hotel to say, hey, listen, we're trying to get this videotape, and I'm going to put you on with Sean Combs, and he's going to let you know what he can do for you if you can get that beating videotape. She's been there to, set up the appointment for today's witness, Jane, to get her teeth redone because Sean didn't like the way her teeth look. She has been there every step of the way, tracking down Cassie. Where are you? Where are you? Tracking down Mia. Where are you? Where are you? Over and over again. I really want to hear from Christina Caron or a security guard We know that Sean Combs wasn't driving himself around to any of these places, whether it's to a hotel or whether it's to dinner. Security guard was always there. A security guard, a driver, drove Sean Combs allegedly to Kid Cudi's house, all right, for when he, burglarized his home. So I need to hear personally, if I'm a juror, even just someone sitting watching the case, Christina Caron, where are you? And where are you security guards? Or where are you drivers? Someone who was just ever present. I got to hear from those people. And I would only imagine that that's who they hopefully have set up to really tie their case together.
To help also establish the criminal enterprise as well.
Exactly. Exactly. Because even though she's not named in the lawsuit, she could be an unnamed, as many people have, unnamed co-conspirators, right? Or maybe part of a sealed indictment. We don't know yet, but she's too close to that fire to say that she has not gotten hot. Oh, she's gotten hot by that fire. She's just way too close to it.
But is she going to get burned? Now we'll have to see what happens.
You got that right. I would imagine if I'm KK, as they call her, I'm telling everything, and I'm hoping that that will be enough to make this go away. And I'm not saying that, oh, I wish that happens and that Sean goes away. I'm just saying if I'm KK, that's going to be my strategy because that's going to work best for me. I'm telling it all. I've got immunity and I can't go down. I don't want to go down. I'm just thinking about the mindset of her. And if she takes the stand, I think that's the only way that she can go, or else she's going to go where Sean goes, and that is behind bars.
But she's also named in the civil suit. So if in fact she does get immunity and testifies for the prosecution, can't that harm her potentially in the civil lawsuits in which she is named?
Absolutely. It absolutely can. Because if she gets immunity for just the case, for just this particular case, right? And in terms of the other, what, I don't know, people say 60 to 80 to 100 lawsuits, that is still to come. After Sean Combs or KK or anybody on the stand, they are open to all of these other civil lawsuits. So here's another interesting proposition that I was talking about with someone is that each state, there are about 33 states that have their own RICO statutes too. They could, if they wanted to, bring their own state RICO charges. Let's say in Florida, for example, against Sean Combs. Will they do that? I don't know. But I'm saying that the doors are open for so much legally to happen. And you are correct. That does not put her in a position to make him good or be, whole outside, on the other side of a civil case that plays out. Absolutely. They're facing years and years of lawsuits, both of them, after this is all done, regardless of what happens.
Let's talk about the defense. What is the defense strategy? Who do they put on? How do they help them? What do they do?
They might bring on many of the people that have come to the courthouse and supported. He has had a former girlfriend come, two former girlfriends, mothers of his children, right? So they may take this stand. Some people have talked about Young Miami, who has spent a lot of time with Sean Combs, and how she could potentially take a stand as some type of character witness saying, this is something that never happened with me. You're going to hear from their own expert witness, the same way that we heard from Dawn Hughes, who was the forensic psychologist who talked about why people stay in abusive relationships. They're going to bring their own witness and say, well, this is what was going on with him. He was a sex addict and he was a cocaine addict. And this is why he acted the way that he did. That's really the best that they can do at this point to say, hey, this is what was going on in his defense. The other thing that they could do, and I don't know how you feel about this, but could he take the stand? That's the big question. Could he take the stand? Not a very good idea. If KK comes on though and puts him under the bus, if I have Sean Combs in his ego, I'm thinking, oh, maybe it's good to put me on there. But if we think back to his tape, his apology, where he had time to put together an apology for that beating, didn't work out very well. And then he would have to face that on cross. So I would imagine they would not have him up there, but all these other people to talk about his character, to talk about who he is, maybe even as a father. I mean, all those doors are open to try to humanize him, for the jury to say this man has done a lot of good. Do not put him behind bars.
Well, Suge Knight said he should testify, but I don't know if he's someone, considering his situation right now, being behind bars, is a good person to take advice from. But attorney can advise someone what to do, whether to take the stand or not, but ultimately his decision. But I could definitely see his counsel telling him, do not take the stand. It's not going to be good for you.
Absolutely. And like you said, okay, Suge, appreciate your advice. Are we listening to you? Interestingly enough, his name has come up over 50 times also. So that's a whole nother story. So I see why he's even been brought into it, because people have brought him into it because of their testimony. You are correct. An attorney will tell you all day, do not testify. Do not testify. Now, I covered the Sean Combs case back in 2001, and this was a shooting and bribery trial. But he did testify, totally different circumstances. You know, even Jamal Shine Barrow, who went down for him, will say that was the deal. So I don't think it hurt Sean Combs that he testified. But, you know, here is a totally different story. He should not testify. To withstand what happens to a witness on cross, it is almost sometimes humiliating, embarrassing, because I mean, they just test you, test you, test you. So many doors have been opened for Sean Combs. I don't think he would come out in anything other than crumbles if he took the stand. There's too much he would have to own up to. He's an unlikable, just kind of person in terms of what they've heard. And I don't think that it would prove well.
So what is your prediction? Is he guilty, innocent, hung jury on some counts? What do you think?
I think that he is going to go down for that crossing state lines for prostitution. I think that the sex trafficking, perhaps, if they really do believe that someone was coerced, and I'm saying more yes than no, that we will get to that point of sex trafficking. But with the RICO, I think that there's kind of a relatability problem, and I'm not sure how the jury will see RICO in the way that the law sees it. Granted, they're going to get jury instructions, and they're going to be told, like I told you, did he do this? Did he do that? Well, then RICO. But we just have to see if the jurors really kind of believe in this whole idea that RICO is something that we should be sticking on Sean Combs. Because here's the truth. He did have a lot of viable businesses before any of this. And RICO says that your business only existed in order to do this. I don't think that jurors are going to go for that. I think they're going to say, well, wait a minute. You mean the liquor company, his clothing company, his marketing company, his television station, all of that was just to have prostitutes? I just don't see them going for that. But the other two charges, definitely that door, they have walked in. They're pretty much at the finish line with that.
Is there any last thoughts or anything that we didn't cover that you like to share with the viewers about this case?
Well, you know, I just think that it's one of those cases where you have a very interested public for good reason. You know, we have music that has kind of shadowed generations of people, and it's difficult for people who are nostalgic about the music, and the people who come to court, you know, they're on his side. I've been to court cases, but this is really one of the few cases where I've seen so many people be just so interested. I mean, people missing work, people coming from Sweden and Asia, you see them coming in, they just want to lay eyes on him or hopefully get into the spillover room. So I think that this is just one of those cases that is so big, much bigger than you would ever think. But being at that courthouse where outside is like a reality show, it's a whole different story. But people are so interested in it for a reason. And I will say there's a lot of support for Sean Combs. But really, at the end of the day, it is those jurors who will be making the decision.
Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate your insight of this case.
Certainly. Thank you so much for having me. Good to see you.
Let's welcome Sarah Krissoff, who is a defense attorney with Cozen O'Connor's White Collar and Investigation Practice. She is a former assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. Sarah, thank you so much for joining the show today. We really appreciate your insight, especially from someone that worked in the Southern District of New York. Let's talk about the Diddy case. How is the prosecution doing in this case?
They're definitely following their playbook. They have a certain way they do these cases, and they are doing that here, right? They're just trying to layer upon layer of evidence. They're going slowly and methodically through all of these witnesses. They're, a little bit disjointed, I think. They have a lot of cooks in the kitchen here. There's a big team, and they may not know sort of exactly what other members of the team are doing, but it's, I think going in to evidence as they would expect.
So the prosecution has the burden, and through the indictment there is sex trafficking, a RICO charge, and also transportation across state line. Let's talk about the RICO charge. Can you explain to the audience what the RICO charge is and who has helped substantiate the RICO charge for the prosecution?
Listen, the RICO charge is basically a fancy or sophisticated way of showing there's an enterprise and they're engaged in illegal conduct. They've done illegal things in order to sort of prop up or support the enterprise. The enterprise itself can be a legitimate or an illegitimate enterprise, right? You can actually have a totally legitimate business and have illegal activities that are done in order to support that business. So, I mean, I think the RICO charge is probably one of the most challenging charges for the government here. They have tended in recent years to use RICO charges for everything, right? We've gone away from a really traditional use of RICO charge and organized crime type of scenarios to sort of a really broader use of it in cases like this. So I think that might be one of the tougher charges for them to get to here, and it's certainly one that the defense is trying to attack.
What witnesses helps prove the RICO charges?
I mean, they've sort of put on a number of employees to talk about sort of the enterprise itself, the operations of the business. They did put on Mr. Ferguson, who was the CFO of the business. I think, frankly, the only reason they put him on was to sort of buttress the RICO charge, because in a lot of ways, some of the information he gave was helpful to the defense. He said, I didn't really see anything criminal. Combs is a brilliant businessman. I admire him. He gave a lot of testimony that was positive for the defense, but I think they had to put on someone who was high up in the organization, and they did that through Ferguson.
Let's talk about the sex trafficking charges. Who do you think helped prove that, and how did they prove that for the prosecution?
Yeah, I mean, they've divided up these sex trafficking charges per victim, right? So that the jury can say, hey, even if we don't find one victim credible and we're really not seeing the sex trafficking with regard to this particular victim, we are satisfied the government's met their burden with this other victim. So they've divided it up per victim, sort of understanding that, that's probably, I think, a better strategy for the government to do that in case the jury doesn't find that they've met their burden in all of those counts. But central to those sex trafficking counts really is the victims we've heard from. Jane, as we've heard from for the last few days, and Miss Ventura and others. And I think those are sort of central to the sex trafficking charges, and this idea that Combs sort of forced or coerced or used violence to convince those women to participate in these sort of freak-offs or hotel nights, as Jane calls them.
Do you think that the prosecution has met its burden in regards to the sex trafficking charges?
I mean, I think that's really not for me to weigh in on. I leave that to the jury, and they're not done yet, right? They have more. There's more to come. They are doing this piece by piece. They certainly feel strongly about the strength of their case. The defense here has a very strong counter narrative. They have, unlike some cases where the defense is simply that the government hasn't met its burden, the defense here is this is really a different story. You're telling a story that is not truthful, is not what happened. That the defense has a narrative here that they're trying to pursue.
As to the transportation across state lines, who has helped substantiate that case for the prosecution, and how did they go about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, that is both, I think, these female victims and also the sex workers who've already testified. Although, if I'm recalling correctly, I think some of the sex workers didn't transport across state lines. But I know Jane, in fact, I think testified today or on Friday about a particular sex worker that was brought down from New York to Miami to participate in a sexual activity with her and Mr. Combs. So that is, I think the base of those charges is coming in again through the female victims and also through the sex workers who have testified.
Who do you think is going to be the next witnesses for the prosecution?
Yeah, I haven't sort of seen who's next on their list. I think they like to sort of spread out the victims, right? So they during the victim testimony, the jury is really wrapped. It's very emotionally charged, and then I think that is usually followed up by some more ministerial witnesses who just need to testify to get in certain bits and pieces of evidence, but so the jury and the rest of the team in the courtroom, frankly, can just take a breather for a minute. But they've sort of alternated sort of more engaging witnesses with less engaging witnesses.
And you talked about like the prosecution's playbook. What does that exactly entail in these types of cases?
So, I mean, what they're very, very good at doing is preparing for trial, right? And in this case, they had a huge roster of alleged victims to choose from because so many women have made allegations against Combs. So they could really, interview many of those women and decide who was going to be best for them, right? They could really pick and choose the victims that they were going to put on the stand in the course of this trial. And then they do a very good job of preparing their witnesses. They are thinking of all of the areas of cross-examination and trying to draw those areas out even during direct examination. So there's nothing that's really a surprise during the cross-examination.
Let's talk about the defense. Who do you think is going to testify for Diddy, and how is it going to help him with the allegations that are against him?
Listen, the defense has set forth a narrative here from the beginning. They've said, you're not going to like Diddy. He's a bad guy. These were violent, horrific relationships, but it wasn't a federal crime. And I've heard defenses like that be successful before, right? I mean, I've seen it in a murder case before where essentially the defense attorney stood up and said, my client was involved in this murder, but it wasn't a RICO murder, and therefore you can't convict him here. And he was successful on that. And so the idea is really, the defense is running with is that this isn't a federal case. These federal charges don't apply to this conduct. And it's really almost more of a legal argument than a factual argument.
The defendant has filed motions for a mistrial. Does it have any validity, and do you think in fact there will be a mistrial?
I mean, there have been sort of repeated motions from the defense regarding particular witnesses and particular things that have happened during trial that the defense has said are impermissible. I mean, I think this trial judge is going to say no mistrial, right? It's very unlikely that the judge, after allowing particular testimony in, then says, oh, wait, that was a mistrial based on the testimony that I allowed in. You can have circumstances where a witness says something that they are not supposed to say, which can be incredibly damaging to the defendant. And, that sort of has more chance of success with a mistrial motion. But I think I think thus far, I don't see a lot of, real winners in the mistrial motions, but what the defense is doing is preserving all of those arguments for later, right? So when the case is looked at on appeal, he can say, all of these egregious things happened in the trial court that shouldn't have happened. I objected at the time. I moved for a mistrial. The appellate court has to correct those things.
The defense has an opportunity to cross-examine a witness. In regards to Jane Doe, where do you think they're going to go, and why would they go in a particular way when they cross-examine her?
I mean, I think they're going to do the same thing that they did with some of the other victims, although frankly, they took a very sort of different tone with the other victims, or it just really depends on who's doing the cross-examination and how they're going to manage that. But the idea is they're really going to pick away at her story, show inconsistencies in her story, and show motives for her to not tell the truth.
The makeup of the jury is 8 men and 4 women. Does that help the prosecution, hurt the prosecution, help the defense?
Yeah, I'm not particularly concerned about the gender per se. I mean, I think what the jurors' personalities and what line of work they are in and their family relationships, that can play a bigger role in sort of whether they're jurors are going to be more favorable to the defense or more favorable to the government here. But the gender in and of itself, I sort of don't get too excited about.
You hear that jury instructions, what the jury read when they deliberate, are really important. Can you kind of explain why it's so important, and why would it be so important in a case like this?
So the jury instructions are really essential for a few reasons, right? One, the judge has to get them right. Otherwise, the case gets overturned on appeal. So the judge is very conscious of getting them correct. Second, in a case like this, where like the defense's entire argument is he did bad things, but he didn't engage in a racketeering enterprise and he didn't engage in sex trafficking, the jury has to know, what is sex trafficking? What is racketeering? And so what the judge tells the jury on that is of the utmost importance. And you're going to see a lot of fights between the parties on, the exact words of those jury instructions.
If in fact he is convicted, do you think that there would be a viable appeal for him? And if so, what potentially could be the appeal based on?
Listen, I think there's almost always a viable appeal. And so whether the Second Circuit agrees with me or not, we'll see. In this particular case, one of the things that's really surprised me is really the breadth of the evidence. They've really, the government, they being the government, has incorporated a huge amount of evidence spanning a gigantic period of time. And so they've sort of thrown everything into the pot here. And I think that is a risk for them. Usually I find that their cases are a little bit more narrow here, and they've thrown sort of everything that Combs has ever done into this racketeering bucket. And the risk of that is the appellate court says, hey, listen, this was highly prejudicial evidence that didn't really go to the core of what you had charged here, and you need to do this again because the defendant didn't get a fair trial.
Is there anything else that you could think of that the viewers should know about this case, or any insight that you can give about this case?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just particularly interested in the media coverage of it, right? There's so many reporters who are really providing a minute by minute, or at least 10-minute by 10-minute update on the trial. If the court had allowed video or televising, there would be a lot of people watching this. So there's really an enormous amount of interest in it. People are following each witness as they testify. So I think there's a lot of the attention to it is good and bad, probably, for both sides here.
Yeah, for example, Jane Doe, that her attorney has stated some concerns about people saying who she is. And then also Mia, who's under a pseudonym as well. There are allegations that someone reported who exactly she is. How is that balanced in the court with such a high profile case to protect someone?
Yeah, I mean, the government took the steps they have available to them to anonymize the witnesses, and we have this jury that's protected, and but it's just that's not absolute, right? It's just that there are lots of things they are doing, including, you know, shielding the public from seeing a number of the exhibits which are explicit or which may have victims' names on it. But it's just, you know, with the amount of attention you have here, sort of it's you know, not surprising that some of this information leaked out, although unfortunate, frankly, because you never want a victim to be in that position. Certainly, I mean, I think when someone and you heard that, I think in the testimony of Mia, who said, and Miss Ventura, who said, I didn't tell people about what was going on because this is just it's so embarrassing. I'm so traumatized. I was in fear of all of the things that were going to happen if I did that. So, you know, that's the same position a lot of people are in.
Thank you, Sarah, for your time. We really appreciate your insight in this matter.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us on Unresolved, the Diddy cases. Stay tuned for our next episode.